what we mean by traditional Asian thought, and then we're going to start in on talking about what's called depth psychology, which is essentially Freudian and Jungian psychology, and why I think that's a really good match for looking at Asian traditions through a Western lens. Then we're going to talk a little bit about Hinduism, the first religion we talk about. We're essentially going to start on the western end of Asia with India, and then work our way east through Tibet, China, and then Japan. Okay, a lot of traditions we are not going to talk about in this semester. I should mention to you, we're not going to talk about Southeast Asia. We're not going to talk about Islam, which is, even though has a large presence in India, and actually now in China, is really different. We really consider it to be a Western religion, Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, okay, different tradition. So we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about Southeast Asia and the traditions there, mostly because we just don't have time. We're not going to talk a lot about Korea, mostly again because we don't have a lot of time. Okay? And so there are some traditions, especially the cultural traditions that inform the religions and the philosophy that we're just not going to have time to get to. So we're going to hit the big ones: India, China, Japan, and Tibet. And I apologize if your favorite Asian religion tradition is not in here. There's one big kind of gap here that we're not talking about this semester. We're not talking about Jainism. Anybody here heard of Jainism? Jainism. We're not going to talk about Jainism. We're not going to talk about Sikhism. These are also Indian religions. Jainism being sort of contemporaneous with Buddhism, also a rebellion against, if you will, a reform of Hinduism that's similar to Hinduism and Buddhism. We just don't have time to really get into it and talk about it. I spend a lot of time on Buddhism, you'll notice. That's because I like Buddhism a lot. It's probably the thing I know the most about. So, your subject, unfortunately, to what I know about, so you're going to hear a lot about Buddhism. But I think it's good. Okay? There's a reason for that. One of the reasons that also is good about that is there's a lot of Buddhists in America. Buddhism is really growing rapidly here. So it's also probably one of the Eastern religions you're going to encounter more likely than some of the other ones. Okay? There's something else I wanted to say too, and I'm spacing out on it now. So it'll come to me and I'll remember what it is. All right, so let's talk about traditional Asian thought. And this will be the first lecture. So what is traditional Asian thought? Okay. What do we think about when we think about Asian religions? And this is something that's always interesting to me because I think most Westerners tend to lump all Asian religions into one category. They're all kind of the same. And unfortunately, our media portrayal of Asian religions is very typically does this. You won't really see, the differences between a Buddhist and a Taoist and a Hindu person in a media portrayal. It's all kind of lumped together a little bit. It's all this sort of vast, mysterious thing from the East, and this is how it was presented. Certainly in the 1800s, the presentation of the stuff is the vast mystical arts, sometimes called the dark arts, even back in the 1800s. Seeing it as something that's this kind of this little inflection of evilness to it. And typically, one of the human characteristics is anything we don't understand, we tend to project characteristics onto it. And I think this still occurs today, though not as much as it used to, and certainly not as much in California. Recently, I don't know, anybody here ever watched the Kung Fu TV episodes from the 70s? Some of you guys maybe more closer to my age remember that. This was a show that was broadcast from 1971 to 1974 thereabouts, and it starred David Carradine as a Shaolin monk who was in the Old West, and he'd walk around, and these bad white people would, incredibly prejudiced, try to beat him up, and he'd just whip it out the kung fu and take him out. Indians would come, and they would shoot arrows at him. He'd block the arrows and kung fu them. It's actually I just recently got the DVD box set of this. It's actually an amazing television program. I I mean, it's so far ahead of its time with actually portraying a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in this class to Western audiences, largely at that time in the early 70s. Really, the mass of people in America really have no idea about any of this stuff. I mean, karate was known as far as martial arts. That had been introduced in the 50s and the 60s, and that was becoming popular. Bruce Lee was on, the Green Hornet television show. Kung Fu was almost unknown in this country. Chinese martial arts and Chinese philosophy, almost unknown in a large sense. And so the show is incredibly groundbreaking for the time. And actually, I'm going to try, I think, this semester to bring some excerpts. I'm working on finding some real choice excerpts and bringing them in and showing them in class. So hopefully we'll get a chance to watch a little bit of the show together. And remind me if I forget, because I really like to do that this semester. Bring some in for you and let me see it. Yes?
Are these slides going to be on Blackboard?
These are all on Blackboard, yes. They're already up there. Okay, all the slides for the whole semester. Okay. So, but even though as good as this show is as well done as it is, and I really think it's just an incredibly groundbreaking thing. It's the best thing, watching it now compared to what's on TV now, it's just far superior. They'll probably never make another show like this. But even then, I was watching an episode the other night with my son, who's 4 years old, and I'm trying to get him to absorb this stuff. And the main character, Kane, who's played by David Carradine, is sitting and meditating, right? And he's meditating in a Hindu posture, right? So even this groundbreaking show, trying to show, this Buddhist, essentially Shaolin monks or Buddhist monks, he's sitting and meditating, with his fingers like this, like you'd like to see in a yoga class, which is, I'm sure there are Buddhists who do it, but it's typically, we see it here in America, it's done as a typically Hindu kind of meditation, right? In Zen people, you guys don't meditate like this, right? Yeah, usually like this. Yeah. We'll talk about that in different hand postures later on. But so even in this wonderful groundbreaking show, here we have this sort of mishmash of putting things together, right? This Buddhist and Hindu stuff is all kind of lumped together, right? And sometimes the philosophy that he spouts in the show is really straight on Buddhist stuff, and sometimes it's kind of like you're not quite sure what it is, right? And that is very typical about media portrayals of these religions. Now it's gotten better in recent years. Now, especially in California, we have lots of gurus and monks and all sorts of different things here. And we've now been living with these guys probably since the middle 70s or so, early 70s. So now we understand a little bit better. And some sects of Buddhism, for instance, like Zen Buddhism, which has been in the United States since the 50s, we understand a lot better. So it is becoming more distinct, but it's something to be aware of, that we kind of tend to lump these things together. So one of the goals of this class is for you to be able to distinguish, what is what. Okay? What's a Buddhist? What's a Hindu? What's a Taoist? Taoism would be the hardest one. Okay. And so that's one of the things we're going to do. So that's just why we ask this question: what is traditional Asian thought? Okay. And by traditional Asian thought, what I really mean is religion, philosophy, ethics, psychology, to some degree medicine. It's what we call soteriological practices, health practices. All these things. The study of mind and behavior, sort of totality of what is a human being, kind of encompasses all these things. But if you want to think of the simple answer, religion and philosophy. And in the Eastern traditions, religion and philosophy are a lot more closely tied together than they are now in the West. In Western countries, there's been a divergence. Philosophy has become very academic, and religion has stayed very religious. So the interface between them has become quite distinct. In Eastern traditions, it's not quite as distinct. And why traditional? Why do we talk about traditional as opposed to just saying Asian philosophy, Asian religion? Why traditional? The main reason is that because these things is found a long time ago, and a lot of them have come to America and they've come to other places, there's been amalgamations of these things. And so there's been mixtures of things. And a good example of this would be Sikhism, a wonderful religion from India, where they've incorporated lots of elements of Hinduism, and they've also incorporated elements of Islam, and probably other religions as well. And so the idea of studying traditional Asian thought is that we want to get the distinct, characteristics of each thing. So we're going to study the traditions, the old traditions, as opposed to the amalgamation. Once you study the old traditions and you get a good grounding in that, you'll be able to recognize which religions, which philosophies are amalgamations of things. So when you go up to Ojai, for instance, and you go out way out into the valley, you go up to the meditation mount there where they have a Theosophical Society has their place out there, and you start reading some things about theosophy, you can see, oh, they took a little of this from Judaism, a little of this from Hinduism, a little of this from Christianity, they kind of mix it together, right? You'll be able to recognize that. But if you just studied that to begin with, it would be hard for you to go back and recognize this is Buddhism, this is Hinduism, this is Taoism. Right? So that's why we study traditional stuff. Does that make sense? You're going to get the real old school first, and then you can get the mix, the remix. Okay. Also, the other thing is that when a lot of these exponents of traditional Asian thought come to America, they tend to get sanitized to a certain degree. They tend to, a lot of the darker parts of them, and many of these Asian traditions we're going to study have what Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist, would call the shadow sides to them. They're not just all light and beautiful and sweet and airy. They also have the dark, the mysterious, the anger, the aggression, the sex, the darker stuff. They also incorporate those. Those are also part of the human condition, and these traditions really take those into account. But a lot of times when they come to America, that stuff gets left behind, and we only get the sweetness and light part. And so again, to go back to the original traditional stuff, you're going to get more of a fuller picture of these traditions, these philosophies, these religions. And I want to make sure that you get a little taste of everything, not just the Western sanitized version. Question?
When you say traditional, does that also mean at some point in time, or is that the current thinking in Asia now?
I'm going to tell you that it means some point in time in the past. In some cases, it is the same as the current thinking, and in some cases, it's not. And I think if we just go back to what we're calling the tradition in the past, we're going to be a little safer, of saying this is where it came from. It may have changed now, but this is the origins of it. Now, there's a lot of variations of this, and this is the problem of looking at this stuff is compounded because some of these traditions have been created in response to other traditions. And the one that comes to mind that we'll talk the most about in this class is Hinduism and Buddhism. Buddhism is essentially a reform movement of Hinduism. It's a reform of Hinduism, rebellion against Hinduism. Hinduism has these kind of things, these whatever things going on, and Buddhism comes along and says, no, we're reacting against that to form something new. And so you could say, well, if you're really super traditional, you go back far enough, well, we just consider Buddhists to be just another kind of Hinduism. And there are Hindus who actually really believe that. They believe Buddhism is just now another kind of Hinduism. It's just another branch of Hinduism. Okay? But Buddhists would not say that. Most of them wouldn't say that. Okay? So we have to be very careful about doing that dance around these things. And again, why we're not studying something like Korean Zen Buddhism, because somebody would argue Korean Zen Buddhism is its own branch of Buddhism. It's distinct. It's got its own distinct practices. It's its own distinct, ways of looking at things, teachings, those kind of things. And other people would say, no, it's just an offshoot of Chinese Buddhism. It's the same, it just went to Korea and got established there. It's a constant cultural thing. But basically the same, or it's the same like Japan, I think we're going to try to sidestep a lot of those arguments. Those are very good questions. And I think if you get enough grounding in the traditional stuff, the old school stuff, the origins of this stuff, that you'll be able to go out and study those kind of questions for yourself very well. And that will be one of my goals for you in this class. Okay, so one American psychologist, James Hillman, said that a lot of these religions come to America smelling only of sandalwood and not of crap. I think he used a more expletive word than crap. But you get my understanding here. So one thing, and I think this is especially true in California, we've had all sorts of weird gurus pop up, and their authenticity is often suspect, and they've taken, parts of these Asian religions that they feel are going to be Westerners going to respond to, and they've left out the stuff that's going to freak them out. And they've done this for manipulative purposes. And you can judge for yourself who these people are, and it's not for me to pass judgment on them, but I think, again, it's important to go back to the original sources here. Has anybody here ever heard of Zen Master Rama? He's His name was Linz. His last name was Linz. This is a guy who set himself up as a Zen master. I think he was in California, he was in a few places, and again, I don't mean to criticize him, but his claim to being a Zen master was he was a reincarnated Zen master, and he had his resume was, reincarnated Zen master, and before that he was a Hindu, guy, and before that he was some Taoist guy. That was his resume for why he was a Zen master. And he would go and do seminars and charge people money, and, do the whole thing. And I think if you understand this stuff from its, true origins, you're going to be much better informed, even as a consumer of this kind of stuff. You'll see that guy go, well, maybe there's a little Zen in there, but, it's not very traditional. What he's saying is really not what, you were practicing with a, hardcore, traditional Zen group. It's very different. It's very, very different. And so this class will help you be better consumers of this stuff if you become interested in it. Or better avoiders of this stuff. I want to avoid this, yeah, I know who to avoid now. Does that make sense? Yeah.
He actually had past lives on his resume?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
You knew what the cycle, huh? You stay the same spot every time, huh?
No.
Yeah,
and when we talk about Buddhist, how Buddhists view reincarnation, it'll become even more confusing. So we'll talk about that because the Tibetans typically, will invoke past lives, and they were somebody in the past life and they got reborn, and they're doing something in this life, and but what actually gets reborn is a big question. We'll talk about that later on. When you come from a religion that doesn't believe in a permanent eternal soul, what's actually being reborn from life? That's a very interesting kind of conundrum. We'll talk a lot about that. Okay. So we can make some generalizations about the traditional Asian thought. So let's make some generalizations for the day, and then what we'll do is, as the semester goes on, we'll hone these down and look at more specifics within each of the religions and philosophies we're going to discuss. So one thing about traditional Asian thought, the first one I think is it tends to be based on holism as opposed to reductionism. How many people here are science majors? None of the psychologists are raising their hands? Dr. Baker would be very upset, He calls psychology the only true science. I'm kind of, hiding myself when he does that. But in science, one of the things is in modern science, and psychology would be included in this, there's a big emphasis on reductionism, this hypothetical-deductive system where we're testing hypotheses and as we build up, test hypotheses and accept hypotheses or reject hypotheses, we build up knowledge. We start little blocks and we build up and try to come up with something. Asian traditions tend to operate in a different way. They tend to look at the whole picture first and then work down. So you can think of it as top down versus bottom up. And they focus on a lot of interconnectedness. And they often speak of an underlying reality in the universe which cannot be directly seen or perceived. And it can't be approached directly, straight on, but must be intuited, must be experienced, and something that can't necessarily be easily passed along in language. And this is completely different than Western religions. In Christianity, in some branches of Christianity, for instance, there's also the same idea that God is not, you can't really just directly approach God, but you have to, through prayer, through some sort of intuitive process, through your faith, that's the only way you're going to know God. So it's not different than Christianity, but it tends to be, in the Christian tradition, it tends to be more Gnostic. Gnostic Christianity was a branch of Christianity where God was perceived to be really almost unapproachable. You had to approach through whatever mediators were out there, the devil or the angels or whoever else was out there. But you couldn't directly approach and know God. You could maybe intuit it, you could maybe, find your way in indirectly. But again, a little bit more like Eastern tradition. So one way of saying it is you can use Christianity as a base. You can say Eastern traditions tend to be a little more Gnostic in their orientation. And again, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, wrote a lot about Gnostic traditions, and was very interested in those. And also probably saw in Eastern religions a kind of a similar approach to understanding the universe, understanding God, understanding what's under the reality that's underlying everyday reality. Nonlinearity, right? We tend to assume that reality is molded, from the sort of Henry Ford assembly line, right? Come on. I know I did it this morning. I got up, alarm clock went off, I looked at the clock, 6 o'clock. So from 6 to 6:15, I'm going to get up and take a shower. From 6:15 to 6:30, I'm going to, get dressed. From 6:30 to 7, I'm going to have breakfast and read the paper. From 7 to, 7:15, I'm going to get my kid ready for school. From 7:15 to 7:30, I'm taking him to school. From 7:30 to 8, I'm driving here. From 8 o'clock to 9, I'm getting ready for class. Very linear, right? This is how we live our lives. How many people have an appointment book? How many people here? How many people have a computer calendar? You can be honest. How many people here have no calendar, have no idea what day it is, what time it is? All right, you guys are already enlightened. You can just take off the rest of the semester and you get an A, right? Just kidding. Because even if you don't think you have that calendar, you probably do have that calendar in your head somewhere, right? That we think we've segmented time into this linear fashion, right? It progresses. You're all in school now. Everybody here know what level they are in school? How many people here are sophomores? Freshmen in class? You're not supposed to be here. Don't tell me. Don't ask, don't tell thing. Juniors. Seniors. Lots of seniors. Oh my goodness. So you all know where you are in the hierarchy here. You're all along this line here, right? You're in the hierarchy. You've gone through the assembly line of the university, and you're at this stage in the assembly line. Most of you are at the finishing stage where you get the last coat of paint and a little buffing and, shine you up and send you off, right? But you're all in a line here, right? It's all very linear, okay? And we tend to live our lives as Westerns in a very linear fashion. I'm going to go to school, I'm going to go there for 4 years, I'm going to graduate, and when I graduate, I'm going to get a job, I'm going to start at the low level of my job, and after 5 years, I'll get a promotion and raise, and every year, blah, 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 blah. And then one day, unfortunately, you die, and that's it. Oh, bummer, right? Most Eastern religions, philosophies, are not linear. This is one of the hardest things it is for us to wrap our minds around, because we're so immersed in linear thinking, especially linear thinking about time, that it's almost very, very, very difficult for us to conceptualize a non-linear way of being. And I tell everybody, every semester I teach this class, I tell everybody, the best way to get a sense of this is to go and get in a plane and fly to India and just get off the plane and just wander around. And you will suddenly be immersed in sort of a non-linear, or not, let me say not non-linear, but not completely linear time pattern. Because, especially if you go out in the rural places, you're not in the modern India where they're doing all the computer programming and they've adapted all these Western kind of things. If you go out in a more rural place, you will see that time becomes much more circular. Sometimes it feels much more mythological. Sometimes the rhythms are not like the assembly line, but they're more agricultural based. They're based on the planting and sowing of the plants, right, of growing things that cycles of growing and dying, growing and dying. It's much more circular. And it's very, very hard for us to get a sense of this. And this is a great thing, even when we're involved in a tradition, if we meditate or something like that, we're still thinking, I got 15 minutes to meditate, I got to get up and do this. We're still, in this assembly line. Breaking out of this is very difficult to do. Very difficult to do. But it's something really worth thinking about because it is a very, very different way of perceiving the universe and very pervasive. Okay, and time is seen as really existing in these giant ages. Things very circular. These giant ages. In Hinduism, they're called yugas. Yugas are ages, right? Right now, we're in the Kali Yuga. We'll talk about this more. Kali Yuga, the dark age. Okay? It's considered to be the age of decadence before the cycle ends completely. Right? But they're very circular. These huge time distinctions, huge time cycles, millions of years. We'll talk a little more about that. I think next week or the week after we'll go into that in detail. Okay, multidimensional. Okay, there's lots of what we call condensation. Condensation was a word used by Freud And what it means is that one symbol can have multiple meanings. Okay? And existence is very complicated, it's very colorful, it's lots of things going on. One symbol can have many, many meanings condensed into it. And because of this, in Asian traditions, we find a lot more tolerance of inconsistencies in the traditions. Something that we would say, because we're very linear and we're very rigid, and it's either black or white. In a lot of Asian traditions, because there's so much condensation and so much stuff built into the symbology and the way of thinking, because time is so circular, that a lot of times you can have things that seem to us that they're inconsistent. It's both black and white at the same time. And that's another hard thing for us to get our minds around. We would like to know what the answer is. We want to have a study guide for every class, right? We want to be told what exactly is on the test. Is A on the test or B on the test? We want to know. Well, in an Asian tradition, A and B, they're both going to be on the test in some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's through C, and you need to know that, right? Different. We like things boiled down to it's not quite the same. Okay? Your mind needs to operate in this much more intuitive, kind of flexible fashion to really experience a lot of this stuff. And a lot of the meditation techniques, a lot of the yogic techniques, things like this, in some way are designed to help your mind become flexible, especially now that they've been adapted for Westerners, to help you become more flexible, just so you can understand or intuit the basic concepts of these things. Okay? Reform movements, and reform movements are obviously not just in Asian traditions, right? Also, Western traditions have, religions are full of reform movements, right? Christianity is a reform of Judaism, right? Islam is supposedly a reform of Christianity and Judaism, right? What happens in religions is that, after a while, that somebody comes along and says, you guys have all gotten soft, you've all gotten decadent, you've strayed away from the original intent, the original purpose, so we're going to now have a reform. And in Western religions, that's been really the case. That's certainly in Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. These are three religions that all feel like, the ones that were before them, became decadent and didn't really get the idea, and introduced some sort of reform to them. That's the same in Asian religions too. We have a lot of this. Again, the big one that we're going to study will be Buddhism and Hinduism. The Buddhism isn't so much saying that the original intent of Hinduism was wrong. It's saying it's basically rejecting what it feels like is become a decadent and somewhat empty tradition in Hinduism, according to the Buddhists. And so they come around to, again, this idea where we're going to be more directly involved in practice, more directly involved in religion. And we'll talk a lot about that. Okay? So we see that in Taoism, we see a different thing. Taoism is really not a reform of anything else. And what we'll see with Taoism is how it mixes in with Buddhism, how they affect each other, not really in a reform sense, but in the sense of just sort of coexisting next to each other, and how they have a lot of influence in each other. So we'll see a little bit of that. And of course, within Taoism itself, there's lots of reforms and lots of splintering off and moving around. And that's also the case with Buddhism and Hinduism. Within the religion itself, even though you're still a Hindu, within the tradition, the history of Hinduism, there's been lots of reform movements and splinter groups and people saying, I'm going to go off and do this, and changes, things that have changed, and lots of subgroups. And we'll see that in Hinduism, Taoism, and Buddhism. All three have a lot of that. With Buddhism, we'll see it in a sense of also with geographical migration. And a lot of it will be related to, or at least correlated with the geographical migration. We'll talk a lot about that. Okay. One way you can think of this is, anybody here has read Thomas Kuhn? Thomas Kuhn wrote a book about the evolution of scientific thought, how scientific movements evolve and change. And usually what happens here is he's the guy who coined the term the paradigm shift. I'm sure you've all heard of this idea of paradigm shift. You can also see that these changes in Asian traditions are very much like the paradigm shift in science. They work, I think, in my mind, they work in a very similar way. Things change in a very similar way. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you know what I mean by paradigm shift? In Kuhn's idea, what happened was that you build up a theory, you build up a belief system, and then, which in Western science is consistent with, observable and testable hypotheses. But then what happens is anomalies build up. There's all the exceptions, which tend to be very, very minute in the beginning. As the science, matures, the exceptions become more and more visible, and there become more and more of them. Until eventually, at some point, a new paradigm, a new theory has to come that also explains the exceptions. And then that leads to a whole evolution of the whole scientific theory. And a good example they always bring up, and Kuhn writes about this, is the change from Newtonian physics to relativistic physics, Einstein's physics. And he talks about this, how this came about. And so it's very interesting. So you see some of that in Asian thought. In my opinion, I think when you look at Tibetan Buddhism, when we talk about Tibetan Buddhism, the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism, we'll see some of this kind of paradigm shifting going on. Very interesting. And now we're seeing, in this modern age, now that we're not having new schools of Tibetan Buddhism, we're seeing a little bit of a synthesis of all the schools. So it's kind of coming around a little bit around back. Now we've got all these different schools that sort of had paradigm shifts away from each other. And now what's happening is they're kind of coming back and recombining again. It's very interesting. Okay. So we can make some rough. Again, these are very big generalizations, so they're not completely true. And of course, there's always exceptions to these. But we can kind of say, in a way, this makes a good sort of generalization. And this, of course, here I'll give you a wonderful map of Asia. It's an old map, and I like looking at maps. I think it's nice to know what part of the world we're talking about. As Westerners, we couldn't, especially as Americans, we couldn't be pretty much geographically backwards. In other words, we don't know where a lot of countries are. If I asked how many of you knew where Madagascar was, how many people here know where Madagascar was? Not the Disney movie. Okay. Yeah, Disney movie is a little bit off. Okay. I mean, how many? Okay, so let me ask. This is fun. We'll have a little fun here. Okay. So, how many people know what this island is here? Can you see the map here? Sri Lanka. Good. Okay. And how many people know what this area is down here? Indonesia. Okay. And how about over here? This is a really funky map. You know what this country is? Where? Close. It's kind of badly drawn. It should be Oman, Yemen in here. Where Michael Jackson's building his new, everything that's going on over there. This is an old map, so it's not actually very accurate. It's a little bit unfair to ask you about this. But anyway, the areas we're talking about here: India, Tibet, which is up here, China, Japan, up there. Okay. But you know what this is? I don't know. Good. Very bad map. Old map. Good. So it's nice to know where we are. So the nice picture of Asia there kind of give you a sense of, the air part of the world we're talking about. Now we're also talking about probably the majority of people in the world. Okay? India and China probably have the largest populations of any countries on the planet, and also very large geographic space. Vast countries full of people. So, really, we're talking about these Asian religions and philosophies as being, kind of something different from the norm, right? That's our normal assumption. And we just think, oh yeah, these are these off things over here. It's alternative religions, alternative philosophies. The reality of it is probably there are more people who follow, Hinduism than there are, Christians, at least in this part of the world. Now, when we look at the world overall, we'll see Christianity is actually the largest religion. We'll talk about that later when we talk about Buddhism. We'll have a list of all the breakdown of all the religions. But if you include all these people in China who are officially atheists, officially non-religious, if you include them, as people who follow Confucianism or, some sort of Buddhism or Taoism, some mixture of these things, then the number really jumps right up and becomes very, very large. A lot of people come from these traditions. And then culturally, if you take the religions and the philosophies out of it, and we just look at it culturally, this is really the majority of people in the world. Okay? Quite a few people. Okay, so let's make a rough breakdown. Hinduism, we can call it sort of the religion of the philosophy of cosmic wholeness. Okay? Looking at the big cosmological picture of reality. The big picture of reality. And really Hinduism encompasses almost everything. You can be almost any sort of religious or philosophical persuasion, and you could probably make a good argument that you're a Hindu. Because it is very encompassing, and it also encompasses lots of inconsistencies and lots of opposites. Taoism tends to deal with the so-called natural world, the natural with a big N, because their idea of what the natural world is far, far wider and more encompassing than what we think of the natural world. We think natural world, the state park over there. Taoists have a much, much broader conception of the natural world, which would include a lot of ideas that we would now consider to be, kind of what we've come up with in modern ecology. The Taoists have been thinking that way for, thousands of years. So, really, natural N with a big N. And we also, another way of saying it, also tends to be kind of shamanistic. We'll talk about that at length too. And Confucianism, which is in one way kind of the flip side of Taoism, we're going to talk about Confucianism, kind of flip the other side of the coin of Taoism, but related to it, it really deals with social relationships. This is social relationships, family relationships. And Hinduism has a lot of this too. In Hinduism, it takes the form of caste systems. We'll talk about that a little bit. But in Confucianism, it really takes the form of kind of duty. And also takes the form of familial relationships and casting all social relationships in light of sort of familial relationships. In other words, if you're in China and you have a school teacher, that teacher is called, Shifu or Sifu, we call it, right? Well, that means father teacher, right? So I would be your Shifu, your father teacher. So not only your professor in class, but there's also this tinge of paternalism to my being in front of you and talking to you. That you would relate to me as you would relate to your father. I would relate to you as if you were my children. There's a little tinge of that there. So all the relationships are seen, in the sort of social context of a family. Okay? And then Buddhism, again, one thing I know probably more about than the rest of these is that it's related to psychology. Buddhism really deals with psychology. It really deals with taming your own mind, understanding your own mind, understanding how your mind creates, and your awareness creates your behavior, how your awareness and behavior create the world for each other. Okay? So very, very much focused on psychology. And is in itself, in my opinion, a complete psychological system. And in some ways, again, I'm biased, possibly more complete than a lot of Western psychological systems. Definitely very, very, very worked out in detail. Okay? But what it's not is, it's not focused on, in Western psychology, what we consider to be psychopathology. Right? In the Buddhist sense, the whole illusion of our day-to-day reality is in itself a psychopathology. You don't have to be schizophrenic or have a personality disorder. You just have to be involved and enmeshed in the world to be suffering from a pathology in a pure Buddhist sense of point of view. That makes sense? If it doesn't, don't worry, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail. Probably more detail than you're ever going to want to think about. Okay? So this makes sense. It's kind of a very rough breakdown of these traditions that we're going to talk about. And again, I tell you, it's just that. Don't take it too literally. There's exceptions to every one of these things. There are well worked out, psychological things in Hinduism, and there are well worked out natural stuff, in Hinduism and Buddhism. There's just a mixture. But if you had to break them apart, I think they look a little bit more like this. Okay. So we can really take the elephant metaphor, right? The blind man and the elephant. This is actually an Asian Chinese painting here. The guy is blind man, they're going around this giant elephant and they're feeling different parts of it. One guy's feeling the foot, and he's saying, well, it's like, round like a tree trunk and very leathery and these hard things on the bottom of it. And the guy's up in the ears, he goes, well, I feel it's very flexible and silky and, it's kind of like a big piece of, fabric. And one guy's at the trunk and goes, well, it's long and it's hollow in the middle and these things sticking out. They're all describing the same elephant, but they're just getting a different piece of it. So one of the things in this class is we're a little like these blind men describing the elephant, right? And especially in a survey class like this, it's going to be very difficult to get a sense of the whole thing. I mean, that's my goal for the class, but, again, we're going to have to be like these blind men all getting together and comparing notes at the end, right? And saying, well, let's put all our notes together and see if we can come up with some sort of composite picture, right? That's the idea of this class. And it's both the good thing about a survey class and a bad thing about a survey class. But as a survey class, we're just really going to be skimming the surface of these things. All the things that we're going to talk about in this class, you'll be able to go into in far, far greater detail, okay, than what we're going to be able to do. And my hope is if you get interested in something again, and get interested in something, that you would go and study it on your own and become interested. We may have future classes that will follow up on this class. I do teach a class with Dr. Bushman from the History Department on the psychology of East Asian warrior cultures, where we go and look at the martial arts traditions in much more detail and kind of follow that in. I thought about having a class just on Buddhism, spending a semester just on Buddhism. So we may do these things. If you guys are interested in these things, let me know at the end of the semester, and we'll take all that into consideration. The East Asian Warrior Cultures class is a very popular class. We have a lot of fun in that class. Dr. Bushman's away on sabbatical, so we won't be teaching it this year. But when he comes back, we'll probably do it again. Okay? But we want to have more classes like this, but I want you just to be sure that you realize this is a survey. So we're just scratching the surface here. And all these traditions are very old. They've been around for a long time, a lot longer than our Western traditions, by orders of thousands of years longer. So, there's a real lot of depth here. Okay? Self-individual versus group identity. Again, this is a generalization, but traditional Asian thought tends to be less individualistic, and it tends to be a little bit more focused on groups. These groups can be family groups, they can be national groups, and it depends very much on the country where you find these things. It really depends on these things. So, out of all these traditions, I would say you can look at them in this way. Buddhism tends to be the most individually based, because again, it's a lot based on individual psychology. So it tends to be individually based. You have to make individual effort in Buddhism. Okay? As where Confucianism tends to be very socially, very family based. And in Taoism and Hinduism, you can finally find everything and anything in between. Okay? But in general, I would say there tends to be less focus on the individual. Less separation between self and experience, right? Life is not a video game, right? In a lot of these Asian traditions, we don't think from the neck up, right? In a lot of Western traditions, we're just a head on a stick, right? I'm going to go, I'm going to do this great philosophy, I'm going to be in these equations and this logic, and that's my experience. It's just this academic, intellectual experience. Asian traditions, that's not true. The whole self, the whole body is involved, right? This is really, we talk about mind, body. In Asian traditional thought, we're really meaning the integration. Mind and body are integrated. They're not separate things, right? When an traditional Asian person, one of these philosophies talks about the mind is here in the heart. Mind is related to emotion. Heart, mind, emotions, rationality. They all come from here, right? They all come from the heart. They don't come just from the brain. And there's much more integration. We're tied, as people, we're tied much more closely to the natural world, the rhythms of the natural world, the cycles of the natural world. Taoism is a real big proponent of this. We'll talk about this. Anybody here know about feng shui? Anybody heard of feng shui? This is another popular thing, right? This is how you set your house up, or your office, or your space that you're living in, to be more in tune with the cycles of the natural world, in which case will then help you, your own individual psychology, to be more in tune and more enhanced. Okay? So this is exactly what we're talking about when we have this kind of thing. And related again to these agricultural myths, cyclical time, the idea of rebirth. We'll talk about all these a little bit more. Okay? And the worldview really is derived from these agricultural myths. And this is rice terracing. This is a picture of rice terracing. The typical way you see rice being planted in Asia on these terraces. So people are very much tied very close to the earth. But there's also this idea of transcendence. On the other hand, tied to the natural world, tied to the earth. On the other hand, this idea of transcendence and seeking transcendence. And transcendence, in Hinduism, we call it the idea of moksha, or Buddhism, nirvana. And the idea here is that you're transcending this, the everyday world. This everyday world that we're living in is not the real world. The real universe, the real understanding, the real reality is something that lies underneath or above, and then we need to transcend this illusory world. In Hinduism or Buddhism, it's called Maya, and get to an understanding, an experiential place of this real world, real universe. Okay, and the idea of many of these traditions is to reach this place of these real worlds, this moksha and nirvana, and be able to see through the illusion of this everyday world that we're in. Yes?
Is this something that you just get into the zone just for a quick time being, and just let them do it honestly?
Both. In the Zen tradition, you have satori experience, right, which tend to be short, experiences of this. And then, you have a tradition, in most Buddhist schools, in Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, where you experience this more or less continuously. Now, if you experience it more or less continuously, that's, considered to be like the Buddha. That's the idea. The Buddha is able to really see through things, more or less permanently. But yeah, certainly they're both, and you have everything also in between. And you have different variations of this, what this transcendent reality is. It's very different in Taoism than it is in Buddhism. Taoism, again, tends to probably emphasize this less. Buddhism and Hinduism emphasize it more. Okay? And a lot of the techniques that we'll talk about, meditation, yoga, martial arts, you name it, tea drinking, feng shui, any of these things are related to this. They can be related to this. How do we see through the illusion of the everyday world? And if we're able to do that, can we then bring that insight through seeing through the illusion back into our everyday life? Back into our everyday life. And that's, of course, one of the goals of Buddhism. There's some kinds of Buddhism. Okay? And I would also say probably Hinduism too, related. Bring that insight back into our everyday existence. Okay? That makes sense? If this isn't completely sitting well with you, we'll get into this more. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about this. And there's a lot of variations about what this transcendence is. Even among Buddhists, there's many, many different sort of conceptualizations of this. And it's something that's, the reason you have so many different conceptualizations is that it's something that's very difficult to conceptualize. It's very difficult to talk about it. It's something that's experienced. It's not a neck-up thing. It's a full mind-body, full self-integrated experience. And that's something also in the West we're not really used to very much. We're used to being in our head and being intellectual, and now we're completely academic, and then if we're in our body, we're either eating or we're having an orgasm. Those are our sort of full body experiences that we have, but we don't really typically combine the two things, right? I mean, maybe some people do. Hopefully some people do. Meditation. This is another tradition that we're going to see, or another technique that we're going to see in all the traditions that we're going to talk about in this class. Is there's forms of meditation, and there's lots of different kinds of meditation. Quiet, solitude, silence, removal from the world and returning to it, looking at pictures, saying mantras, chanting things, sounds with special qualities, visualizing things, taking on different postures, and many examples from extreme to mild. We'll talk a little bit in a couple weeks about the sadhus in India, and these guys are the more extreme guys. We'll see pictures of them. Their meditation may be holding their arm up like this for 25 years. Not moving it, 25 years. I can do it for about 5 minutes. So and we'll talk about them. I have pictures of them, so we'll talk about that later. So there's all different kinds of things, but there are meditation techniques, and there are rough similarities between these things. The goals of the meditations do differ among the different religions, philosophies we're going to talk about, but there's a lot of similarities as well. This is a picture of the Zen monk here, typical picture, typical Zen monk posture. And this is, you'll also see, among Buddhists, you'll also see a lot of commonality among the different traditions as far as the meditation techniques. There are some little variations that are particular to certain kinds of techniques, but lots of them do the basic stuff. Most of them do the basic stuff. And we'll talk about that. And maybe we'll even try some, for a few minutes in class. And yoga would be one, those who take a yoga class, you do a little kind of meditation. Think of the whole yoga practice as a meditation. My teachers are always saying that to me, And yes?
Is this a form of transcendence?
Well, that's a good question. Very good question. It can be, and it can be just the opposite. It could also be integrating yourself and being more in touch with natural cycles of the earth. It can really be both, and it can be both simultaneously. So it can be just pure transcendence. It can be pure getting in touch with natural cycles. It can be a combination of the two. It just depends on the tradition. But there will be some kind of meditation. And typically the transcendent stuff is related to some kind of sitting meditation. And a lot of times the being more combined with the earth, being more integrated, is related to some sort of movement. But that's not completely true, because yoga, a little bit more about transcendence. Martial arts, a little bit more about natural cycles. So we definitely see some natural differences here. And what one of my friends, who's very, very knowledgeable about this stuff, told me, he said, Hindu traditions that came out of India tend to be very transcendent. Traditions that come out of China tend to be a little bit more about natural cycles and closeness to the earth. But there's lots of exceptions to that. Okay? But it's one way you can think about it. It's hard for us in the West because our meditative traditions, there are meditative traditions within the Christian church, but they're not like typically promulgated out to the congregation. It's not like everybody goes to Christian church and we're all going to do a meditative prayer for an hour, and we're going to kneel in meditative prayer for an hour. But there is a tradition in the Christian church which does essentially do this kind of meditation. And one of the great writers about this is a guy called Thomas Merton, who was a Catholic monk. And he wrote a lot about this. Actually studied Zen Buddhism quite extensively, and wrote a lot about the commonalities between Zen meditation and the Catholic contemplative tradition. Very, very brilliant and interesting writer. So somebody, if you have time, you might want to check out. But we don't really see a lot of this in the Western traditions. We it's not as common. Yes.
What was that name again?
Merton, Thomas Merton. Last name Merton. We do have these kind of transcendent traditions, though. We have plenty of this stuff. If you all decide, I'm going to give you shameless plugs for my classes all semester. So next semester, I should be teaching a class called Bizarre Behavior and So-Called Culture-Bound Syndrome. So we're going to look at more extreme forms of, what we might call psychopathology. And Dr. Baker has agreed to come into class next semester and lecture on snake handlers. So we're going to have a lecture on these guys who handle snakes. And this is a transcendent meditative practice in some sense of the word. They're certainly doing something transcending. I don't know if it's from the snake venom or just the mindset they're going into. But certainly we do have it in the West. We have lots of different variations of it. But not as central to the core of the religion or the philosophy as it is in the Asian traditions, in my opinion. There's a lot of reliance in stories, parables, fables, myths. Again, this idea of condensation. Many ideas represented in one symbol, condensed down to one symbol. These stories, fables, and myths also tend to be non-linear, can be very circular. We'll read a couple of these things, and you'll get a sense of that when you do some of the readings. I think I said this already. The difference between religion and philosophy are not as strong as they are in the West. They're not as separate. And that's why I'm always using these words together, religion and philosophy. Or sometimes I'll just say Asian thought. That's really what I mean. I mean the integration of those things. Intellect, faith, devotion go together. And I think you can make the case that these aren't so separated as they are in the Western traditions. Again, if you're if you're, say, a fundamentalist, Hindu or a fundamentalist Islamic person, there's going to be maybe a little difference. As a fundamentalist Hindu, your intellectual tradition is very much tied to your religious faith. You're studying the Vedas, which are the oldest Hindu works, in an intellectual way. It's very much tied to your faith. But if you're a fundamentalist Muslim, the reality is you're probably not really dealing with the intellectual. The intellectual stuff's become very academic. You're really not dealing with that. You're dealing with the faith part of your religion. You're being probably told what to do by somebody higher up than you. Not that doesn't happen in Hinduism. I'm sure it does, but I think it tends to be a little bit more prevalent in the West. In that split of the intellectual stuff, and certainly the Western academic tradition, we see this very, very clearly. We also see it in our traditions about music. One of the things I'd like to do in this class is get Dr. Ted Lucas, to come and talk about Indian music, and I have to see if he's actually going to come this semester. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get him. He's the provost of the university, so he's a very important person and he's very busy. But if I can get him to come and talk to you about Hindu music, he'll talk to you a little bit about Western music, and you'll see in Western music the religious tradition, the religious origins of Western music, and the intellectual tradition split, probably in the 13 or 1400s, and the classical music tradition became its own intellectual thing, and the religious music went over here. In Asian religion, Indian music, they're really still very highly, highly connected. Maybe they're split a little bit, but not nearly to the same degree. And even listening to music can be a transcendental, meditative experience. Why are we interested in this as Westerners? And there's been a tremendous amount of interest and popularity of Asian thought in America, especially in California, since the 1950s. In the 1950s, Zen Buddhism started to become popular in the West, especially among beatniks, and then eventually among sort of youth culture, the alternative youth culture, especially we had in San Francisco, the hippies, those kind of things. Though the level of their real understanding of this stuff can be debated, whether they really became, en masse. Everybody, if you were a hippie, didn't mean that you were you actually really understood Zen. Again, a lot of these Asian traditions were appropriated for people, who wanted to live with a so-called, quote, alternative, unquote, lifestyle. So you could say, well, I'm going to take drugs because I'm just going to sit here and be, I'm going to get into the Zen of things. I'm going to be very Zen, so these drugs will help me do that. Well, in reality, if you're a Buddhist, you're prohibited from taking drugs. It's absolutely, not permitted. You're not supposed to drink. You're not supposed to do anything that makes you intoxicated. That just makes the illusion of the world seem more real and makes everything worse. So, you would never do that. But in the 60s, in the 50s, people didn't really understand, the levels of Buddhism, what it really meant. They just appropriate things from it. And so we have a lot of that. But that's the bad part. The good part is that it did help some people to become genuinely interested in it and go more into depth about, into these Asian traditions. And so in the 50s and 60s, Zen was probably the first thing to come over here and be really popular. Certainly in California, Zen was a big deal. Alan Watts was one of the first proponents, Western proponents of Zen Buddhism, though, whether his training in Zen Buddhism probably could be questionable. Very interesting guy. You can buy, he's dead now, you can buy his lectures on tape and listen to him. Very, very fascinating guy. I'm not sure how traditionally Zen, it really was, but, it's interesting stuff, even if it's pulling from lots of different sources. He lived up in the Bay Area, at least the last part of his life. He was an English guy, lived in the Bay Area the last part of his life. And again, you have other people like him, who were in California. Ram Dass, you all heard of him, right? He was a psychologist who worked with Timothy Leary, and they all took LSD in the East Coast. And Ram Dass, unlike the other ones, actually felt like this LSD experience gave him a glimpse, through the illusion of reality. And rather than taking more drugs, he decided to go to India and really, learn how the Hindus really do this. And he met up with a guru and studied for many, many years, gave up taking drugs, and became a guy who has come back to the West and written books and taught to people and teaches and does a lot of really good work, helping people, really concrete things, helping people who are dying, helping people who suffer from, certain kinds of blindness, helping set up, agencies to help people, really very in the world, helping people in a very concrete way. He's still around. And he's getting up in age. He's still around. He's in the Bay Area as well. So you see a lot of this, in California especially, is a place where entry point for a lot of this Asian thought into American culture. So we're kind of right in that place where a lot of this stuff came in to America, right? So we tend to be a little bit, ahead of the wave. Now, I don't know about Ventura County, but certainly in LA and San Francisco, this kind of stuff is very, we tend to know more than we think we do. How many people here know what the word karma means? Or you have a general idea what it might mean? Yeah. How many people here have heard the word Tai Chi? You know what Tai Chi is? Slow movement, right? Okay. We know these things. If you're in the middle of the Midwest, somewhere, in Arkansas or Missouri, and you're in the 1980s or 1970s, you want to know these things. Now, the TV, right? Okay? All right. So many of these ideas of West Asian culture are now very commonplace. Karma, meditation, Qi. You've heard all Qi, right? You guys know what Qi is? We'll talk. You'll know by the end of this class. Nirvana, etc., etc., etc. You have a general idea of it. This is all coming to our culture. Okay? And I think part of this is that, Asian thought tends to offer, us an idea to directly experience something. Maybe something greater than ourselves. Higher is a kind of value-loaded word, but something greater than ourselves. And people have written that maybe this has become somewhat watered down in some Western religions. That we don't have this direct connection to whatever that transcendent reality or the earth cycles directly anymore. We're kind of removed from that, especially in this modern world. We live in a first world country. We have these modern conveniences. We get in our cars. We're kind of like insulated from the natural world pretty much. And we're involved in this very academic, intellectual tradition, both in our schools and our jobs. And so we don't really get to experience, this sort of reflective transcendence. And so a lot of people feel that one of the reasons that, Westerners have become interested in Asian, these Asian traditions is because we're lacking the things that it gives us in our own culture now. And I personally think, there's some truth to this. I mean, I won't say it's absolutely 100%, this is the case, but I tend to lean toward thinking that there's some truth in this. I think if we really examine ourselves, as a psychologist, a Western psychologist, I would say that, some Western psychologies, have tried to bring these things into their practices, and especially the depth psychology that we're going to talk about, Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology. Try to bring these ideas, this awareness of ourselves, this awareness of sort of a transcendent reality, or maybe in Western psychology sense, a sub-reality, unconscious reality, we'd say in Western psychology. And so, it tends to make sense to me, this is the case. But, I'm open to listening to counter proposals about this. And generally, a lot of times in the Western traditions, these experiences are mediated by a priest or some other person, and so they're not quite as directly available to you as in the Asian traditions. And you see this even in like religions like Christianity, right, where the reforms in Christianity have been away from the mediation. Let's have, I don't need the priest to interpret the Bible for me. I just get it and I read it myself. And the Bible then will reveal itself to me. That reality, that transient reality, whatever it might be, will reveal itself. So we even see this among Western religions. So I think, in my mind, lends credence to this idea that we tend to be removed a little bit from these experiences. And so part of the things I think we like bring these things in is that we can sort of get back to this. This is maybe part of our human condition, is to experience the cycles of the earth, to experience these transcendent states of reality, and that when we get away from that, we feel like we're missing something. It's a working hypothesis. And one thing that we'll find in our study of traditional Asian thought is that we recognize many paths to God, enlightenment, whatever you might think of, etc., etc., etc. Chance to shed individualism, and all the striving this engenders. Remember, we're on this assembly line, right? Well, have anybody ever here worked in a factory? How many people have worked in a factory? I worked in a factory. Anybody here work in an assembly line? Yeah. How was it? How'd you feel after a day of work? Were you a little tired, run down, mentally especially? Yeah, I felt brain dead at the end of the day. So if you think of our linear lifestyles as kind of an assembly line, I mean, we really are run down by this. I mean, it really runs us down. These Asian traditions give us a chance to rejuvenate. A chance to rejuvenate, to bring in that stuff that will, help us a little bit. Give us some, in a way, kind of spiritual, psychic nourishment, psychological nourishment, if you will. And we can think of it in a way like this as a positive psychology. You guys heard the word positive psychology? Most psychology is based on psychopathology of problems. Positive psychology is based on being optimally healthy, being optimally happy, right? And so a lot of these Asian traditions, are really focusing in on the positive psychology, how to help us be happy, how to help us be, healthy, how to help us, really, really exist fully in the world and live our lives fully. And that's a neat, that's a really neat draw, I think, for this type of thing. Okay, and so why is this a psychology class? Well, you kind of got a sense of that, hopefully, from what I've been saying. But again, this idea that these traditions, help us to get to this either underlying or overlying transcendent reality, or they help us to understand the natural cycles of the earth, or both, is also very similar in a way to what we call depth psychology in the West. And depth psychology really comes from the work of Freud and Jung and their followers. And there's a very good match between these things. In my mind, it's not a complete match. And you got to remember that depth psychology is maybe 50 years old now, maybe it's 100 years old now. It's not that old, right? Hinduism is 5,000 years old, so comparatively, this is a new branch. I once saw a Tibetan monk speak, and somebody asked him a question what he thought about psychology. He goes, time will tell. Somebody asked him the question, was psychology, do you think psychology was psychological practice could be a spiritual tradition? And he said, time will tell. It's too new. And I think that's really the case. So part of what we're doing in this class is we have these psychologies we'll look at, we use it as a lens to help us understand the Asian traditional thought, and also vice versa. We can take Asian traditional thought and help us understand Western psychology. And again, as I said earlier, that will be up to you guys to help do that integration, right? I'm probably not going to give you as much help as you would like on that, but it'll be much more better for you to do it yourself, try to bridge the gap yourself, and ask lots of questions about that. And so that's another expectation. If you leave the class with lots of questions about this that are unanswered, that'll be great. I'll be really happy, because that, unanswered questions mean, more learning for you later on. Okay, and we want you to be lifelong learners, right? Okay.